Today, I'm joined by Owen Cyclops. He is an illustrator and the author of a new book called Channel One. Welcome, Owen.
Hey, thanks. Happy to be here.
I was planning on inviting you on for a long time because I'm a big fan of your work. I only know it through Twitter. That seems to be one of your main propagation mediums. And I wonder, I've seen you quoted or referred to as one of the emerging right wing artists. Would you consider yourself a right wing artist?
That's funny. I wouldn't use that term. I think I know why people would say that. It's kind of interesting because when I first started, it was a lot more political, my whole vibe and things I was talking about. I think there's probably a few reasons for that, where I was at in my life. And also, I had sort of just gotten on board with realizing there were all these, problems in society and the way things are going. And I really thought my focus would end up being mostly on the political sphere. But as I went further and further into it, it became more about spirituality and worldviews and things like that, which is actually kind of where I started. I initially was sort of a weird mystical person. I got really obsessed with the political side, and then I sort of merged those two things together. And that's basically where I'm at now. So I wouldn't describe it that way, but that's probably not totally off base.
Yeah, I think I think we're at a moment where you can slowly start to afford to not necessarily be political, even if you are represent a certain type of politics, because up to this point, just the resistance that everyone was creating towards whatever you want to call it, wokeness, the left, leftism. Um, was kind of I think people that vibe, that energy kind of fizzled out. I think people kind of they know wokeness is bad. There's just no more energy in that field. And I feel like now there's like a thousand flowers blooming in terms of things that are essentially right wing, or you would have called them right wing 5 years ago, but they're just their own thing. So there's art that is wholesome. I mean, wholesome is a weird word, but I feel like your art is wholesome in a way that it's like it's enriching. It gives you like these small like nested epiphanies. It's subtle, it's beautiful, but it's also not overtly political. It's about something that is right wing. It's kind of this eternal fight against entropy. But it doesn't spell it out for you. This is anti woke comic strip number 5. It's not stone toss.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm glad you feel that way about my work. That's really cool. Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know, the term like reactionary gets thrown around, and I think independent of its literal, direct political connotation, it's a really good just term almost like visually because most people are literally reacting to something. And I think that's part of what like clouds and muddies the water a little bit. Like if you have just like a totally normal Christian guy who like owns some guns and like is just a normal Christian guy, you could kind of imagine him pitching it as like, yeah, I'm like a right wing extremist, or he could just be like, yeah, I'm like just a normal person actually. And once those waters started getting a little bit muddier for me, it almost got like more interesting in a way where I was like, am I this like crazy weirdo or am I just like a normal guy? Like thinking about that, I feel like is a big part of my work and what I do, and I think that bleeds through in the artwork for sure.
Yeah, and I feel like being someone on the right, and I would describe myself as right wing politically, but just not having to man the barricades so much. Like I feel like that's kind of exhausted. The idea that I have to position myself as right wing, I feel like that's even last year I felt like that was something necessary, but now there's a whole huge sphere that's been building where everyone can be their own person, and it's also a good thing. I feel like it doesn't really feed into the framing of the left because the left essentially kind of sets the chessboard up, and we play a kind of a heel. We play a foil to the left, and then we kind of I don't know, accelerate the game that they're playing. And now I feel like because there's the movement on this side's just been growing so much, and it's I like, at least to me it feels. I talk to all these people, and that's why to me it feels like, there's a thousand flowers blooming right now. You don't really have to play that. You don't really feel like you're the antagonist in this huge cosmic battle. So I feel like that's actually softening the main narrative as well. Like, we don't need you. We're not against you. We're for ourselves.
Yeah, that's definitely true. There is an interesting, like, playing the heel. That's a really good way to say it, aspect to it. I think for me also that I don't want to call it a divide because it's really not a divide, but that sort of weaving road between like the political and spiritual aspects of it, I found myself more feeling like I was staying in my lane or playing to my strengths or operating in my own domain by letting my natural tendencies come out of being like a spiritually inclined person. Because, kind of like the subtext of what you're getting at in a way for me on my side is that, a lot of people do focus on like the day to day political stuff, the macro political stuff, the political history stuff, and they're good at it and that's what they do and they do it really well. But for me, I'm like, I don't need to pretend that that's like my domain because it's really not. Sometimes when I see them talk about things, I'm like, yeah, I actually don't know about like that particular like constitutional amendment in the 1890s and how it affects like this issue today. Like I have no idea, and it's good that you do, but I don't. And also I think that it sort of clears things up a lot for me philosophically. You mentioned like engaging with other people. A really good example is like weed and drugs and things like that. If I'm talking to someone, if I'm saying, yeah, I probably think if you're like a young man that you shouldn't be smoking weed, especially all the time, but actually you shouldn't do it, in my opinion. That's really easy for me to say and back up and feel really confident about. But then if you drifted over into the political realm of like, well, should like the police come to your house and like lock you up for smoking weed? It becomes this totally separate issue that's almost like, it's almost not really related to like the real fundamental issue of it for me, which is like what you're doing yourself. And I think that that's also part of why I kind of drifted towards my natural domain. Like I said, it sort of de-muddies the waters and it's like, yeah, like we could have a debate about, if the cop should come to your house for X, Y, and Z reason. But what's kind of more important is like what you're doing and how you're living your life from where I'm sitting.
Yeah, it feels to me like you've kind of gathered these layers throughout your life, and at least that's, I've read the intro to your book, and you seem like me to be someone who's gone through phases, and I guess everyone does that. But if you're kind of a public persona, you're trying to kind of you have to be a bit more. You have to think about these things, and I feel like you've obviously done that, and it's very interesting how you represent these phases. And I think it's in that comic X where you illustrate very specifically what what the phases were for you. I mean, what were the these steps that you took to get to the point where you're today?
Yeah, everyone really likes that one. I'm really glad because I was talking to someone about it last night, even, and it really was born from a place of like almost like psychological distress. I was like, wow, I really have to make this. So I'm really glad that other people resonated with it or got something out of it in some way. It's definitely a crowd favorite, you could say. Um, the steps are pretty interesting. I mean, for me, it's my life, I guess. So hopefully I find it interesting. But long story short, I got really turned on to religion as a thing in general when I went to college. I got really depressed, and I ended up, for some reason, just thinking, there's all these really old. It's very like Twitter sphere actually, but this was before that for me, way before that. I was like, there's all these old books around. I'm not getting anything out of my college experience at all in any way. There must be some reason these old books have been kept around for so long. I'm just going to find the oldest books that I can and start reading them. Um, and I think I probably took out a computer and just Googled like what's the oldest book, and I found this book called the Daodejing. That's like the central text of Taoism, you could say, or like the kickoff point for it. Which, in case people don't know, is like one of the Chinese philosophical manifestations. And I read it, and it really blew my mind because it's very thinking about the empty space between things, and a really good way to imagine it is the author saying you have a cup, but the physical material of the cup is only there so you can use the space inside of it. You build a room, but you build the room to use the space inside of it. So we use things to use what's not there. And I was like, wow, this is crazy, man. And it really blew my mind. And the point of that story is that it really opened me up to the fact that I had been misled about what religion is and what religion is about. I guess I sort of just picked up my own cultural milieu of, all those books, like it's probably just superstition and rules and stuff. But here I had this tiny book that was like blowing my mind. And for the next rest of my life, really, I only read religious texts. I really only vibed with religious art and things like that. And that was who I was for a long time. I settled into doing psychedelics, being really into Buddhism, Western occult. That's a whole sort of story in and of itself. And I fell out of that for a variety of reasons. And then eventually I became Christian. That's putting it in like an absurdly tight nutshell. But you could say my home base was doing psychedelics and Buddhism, specifically like Tibetan Buddhism, but being on the outside of it, I wasn't like initiated into like a lineage or anything. And that was my cosmology for a long time before I left it. There's a few reasons. I was asking questions about, basically who made the universe, why do good and evil exist, that weren't really getting answered from that system. And then on the other side, my main way of participating in the spiritual life, which was doing psychedelics, was not really getting me where I wanted to. Those two things and all the other factors that make up someone's life led me out of it. And then I became Christian after that. So it's one of those things where, like, if you come in at season 4, it really doesn't make any sense. But if you watch all the seasons in order, you can see like the logical progression.
Yeah, and it feels like a familiar story. You're not the only one in the sense, and at least in our corner of the Twitter sphere. This sounds oddly familiar. I think parts of it are familiar to me as well. I did have a very massive cringe atheist phase, which you seem to have skipped somehow. You've managed that, which is pretty awesome. I have to.
I started there. That was I was raised in like the cringe atheist bunker passively.
Okay.
Like in my house, we never talked about God or anything like that. I mean, I don't think my parents probably literally ever mentioned it one time. So I sort of started at that phase passively, and then that's where the train left the station.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, you had something to rebel against. Yeah. We had like we were nominally kind of instrumentally religious in my home, and I thought that was very suspect. So at like 12 I was like, yeah, no, I'm out. Guys, this is suspicious to me. And you mentioned psychedelics, and I feel like now there's especially coming out of Silicon Valley and London tech, where I used to work. This is in the new era, and the new age of Aquarius is upon us. That psychedelics are going to heal the anxieties, depressions, and the problems of the new man. Is that the case? Do you have any hopes in that direction? I mean, you seem like you're a veteran of the genre. What's your feeling about psychedelics?
Yeah. Well, just to give a little context there, a veteran, that's really interesting. Maybe I am. I don't know. Maybe I am. Maybe I should get a
More
patch or
than
something on
most
my
people.
jacket.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, after talking about it so much, I've had to figure out how to like pin down my relationship to them. And the way I came to describe it, that I think perfectly encapsulates it, is that I basically went as far down that path as you could go without literally moving to like a commune or something and radically altering your life. So I basically did the most psychedelics you could do in a semi-responsible way without actually like uprooting your life and moving to like literally like a cult or something like that. Who I knew some people who were around that, and I was like, that's pretty cool. How much is it a month? So I did that a lot. The question you asked me is, is there a future there and things like that? Well, I think that in a way, the answer is really no, honestly. But I think that in a way, there's this term that I really like using, which is the obsessive epiphany. I think everyone is really familiar with, you figure something out or you get turned on to something and you're like, wow, we got to tell everyone about this. And once we tell them all, they're going to get it and it's going to be great. And with conspiracy stuff that happens, you're all of a sudden in the car with your friend telling him about this crazy thing that he doesn't really want to hear about. Or Timothy Leary is a perfect example, to caricature him like, oh, if we just give everyone acid, they're going to get it. And I think that in a way, society is going through that with this kind of like new psychedelic, scientific melding thing. Maybe it's not everyone, but you can kind of pick it up in the air, and the average kind of person is already turned on to it a little bit. This idea of like, oh yeah, psychedelics, like they expand your mind and they're kind of sciencey, so they're going to fit in this new sort of paradigm that we're all kind of building together. Um, I don't really think that it's a viable path to go down. I think that it kind of either leads to one of two places, to put it shortly. I feel like either they eventually become just another drug and it becomes like a sensory experience that you're kind of just doing because you enjoy it. Or on the other hand, you're using it as a system of like extrapolating meaningful information from the experience. And I think that it's kind of a big question, but I think that that makes it almost impossible to operate within like a neutral paradigm. Like the Silicon Valley guys you're talking about and things like that, or even just the average person like doing acid or mushrooms or something within this context. I think they kind of imagine that they're like, well, I'm just sort of a smart person and I'm just doing this and I'm not really, it's not part of a religion or something like that. But to take meaning from those experiences involves fitting it into a larger worldview and cosmological context. And I kind of see it as like a folk religion developing in this culture in a way. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I don't really think it's going to be good, to be honest with you. I think that the other thing to touch on there would be that I think people really underestimate the extent to which it's breaking really, really, really hard and really, really, really fast in our situation right now. Like, if you're not part of that world, it's kind of easy to imagine, like, well, yeah, mushrooms and acid, like we had the hippies, like I get it. But for me, the really pressing thing is the ayahuasca and DMT aspect of it, because those are an order of magnitude more powerful than the other psychedelics. Like, it's really not even comparable. And even 20 years ago, 25 years ago, less than that actually, if you hear people talk about it, they were really, really, really difficult to get. And now it's like, my sister texts me at a party and she's like, people are hitting like a DMT vape pen here. So I think it's going to be kind of like when the acid thing broke in the 60s, but a lot more and a lot faster. And I think it's kind of just starting.
Yeah, it's interesting to contrast what people are saying about it. What you see on these like sciency channels. Oh, fighting depression, and all these ailments that are now supposed to be solved with these miracle cures, and seeing it play out in real life. I've seen people who have gotten slightly obsessed with psychedelics, and they're not in a good place, and they haven't been in a good place for years, and it seems to be one of those things that it's very hard to get out of. And I don't think, at least physical addiction from psychedelics, that's not really possible. They also have they don't really work after long prolonged use. So there's physical constraints on how bad you can go, but the mental state that these things create is not necessarily a positive one for many people. And I have many friends who I think even personally wish that they could go back and say, okay, yeah, this wasn't a door I wanted to open, because it's a dark path. Um,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because the word path is really kind of like crucial there in a way, because I think that even when I was part of that world, I'm not like a some kind of like pantheist or something, but I think that certain analogies, especially because they're native to using substances in a spiritual and, let's say, religious context, are very useful. And certain like shaman or shamanistic cultures will describe like the plants as having a spirit, and you're like interacting with that spirit and like maybe even taking on that spirit and things like that. And I could kind of take it either way, if that's like literally true, like a literal spirit, but even just as like a metaphor, I think that you do sort of like take on the mindset inherent in a substance over time. People drink, they get a certain way. People smoke weed, they act a certain way. Most substances have, like, for lack of a better word, a vibe. And as you go further and further down the road of allying with them, it becomes more part of your vibe and mindset. That's just how it is. And yeah, I think it gets pretty interesting once you've gone, 50 miles down that road. And like you just said, you're wondering if it was like a good call or not. I think also there's the other aspect that a lot of what I do now really revolves around worldviews and information and how information functions in terms of how people see things and whether it's all cohesive in their mind has always been something I've been crazy obsessed with. It actually was kind of a problem when I was a little kid, because adults would say something and I would very rudely say, like, oh, but you just said X, but 5 minutes ago you said Y, and those two things actually don't go together. And I actually had to have like other adults take me aside and be like, dude, you can't do that. Like, what are you doing? But that's just how my brain works, for good or for bad. I'm probably obsessed with it to a slightly pathological extent. But my point is that I think when people start using those substances, because they're not ready to start looking under the hood and tinkering around with their worldview and cosmology, it gets pretty weird pretty fast, especially if you suddenly realize that you've been moving wires around. It's not a good metaphor because I don't mean like literally the neurology. What I mean is like, here's a really good example that I always use. I went to a peyote ceremony once, and this woman was like, I looked in the fire and saw my brother talking to me in the fire. The thing is, what you think actually explains that and how that hooks into a larger cosmology of the dead and what happens when we die, and do you have like a spirit that persists after death and all things like that. In order to take any meaning from that experience, you have to start working in that world, because for that girl, what is she thinking now? That when we die we like hang out waiting for people to take peyote so we could like talk to them? Or was it, a Jungian like collective unconscious, like it wasn't really my brother? And that's kind of weird, because then what, it was like a mirage in my brain, kind of, but not really. That's a weird place to go. So I think that people accidentally put these like axiomatic posits into their worldview. And it gets pretty crazy pretty fast, especially if you're in that world, because it's really easy to make fun of, sort of like new agey, I guess, people, and say, oh, everything in your life, it comes to you because of your thoughts. And if you think positive things come to you. If you think negative things come to you. That's just how it works. But when you get people who really start to rewire their life based on that, it could get pretty dicey. And sometimes it's a really hard fall off that horse of, oh man, the universe is like a place of like love and light only. And then like, boom, you get hit with something hard. It could be a long fall off that. And I've seen that happen a lot. That's like part of why I talk about it. I don't really like to get in other people's business necessarily, but when I see like bad spiritual beliefs hurting people and becoming more prominent, that's when I do feel a slight obligation to poke in and allow people to kind of like check their situation.
The path that I've seen people take, kind of the more pathological path that I've seen people take, is they take psychedelics in a party context at a very high point of their life. They go to festivals. It's, they're, I don't know, 23 years old. There's the first festival they went to. Someone gives them acid. They have incidental spiritual experiences. And then they decide that this is something they want to pursue. And then they chase the spiritual experience. And they're like, okay, psychedelics gives you this high, the spiritual experience. And then that has negative consequences down the road, because they're kind of thirsting for revelation, and they're also kind of greedy to contextualize it with whatever tools they have. And as the kind of person who's 23 and goes to festivals, you typically don't have many tools. You're not really studying great faith traditions to interpret all this stuff. And that's kind of the direction I've seen people go down. That's a particular personality type. Not everyone who takes LSD at a festival is going to end up like that, but people who take LSD at a festival and have like minor religious experiences that really affect them deeply can end up in weird situations, like even 10 years, 15 years down the line. They're still there. They're at that festival. That's the highlight of their life. And they're still like, you know, groping for it.
Dude, yeah, that's so true. Yeah, there really is sometimes like a chasing the dragon element to it, to use terms from other like drug abuse, I guess you could say. For me, there's also like a squeezing blood from a stone kind of thing. There's a few metaphors that really worked there. I think also it got really interesting for me because along the way, I had really allied with other substances also. I like that term. Like I really became like a close, I thought I was a friend, let's say, with like weed and alcohol along my journey. And it was interesting because when I stopped using those, there's this, it's similar in a way that I think that someone might only pick up on if they were kind of like sadly like addicted to those things. Because if you go to a party and you're used to like smoking and drinking and other people are smoking and drinking, let's say, there's this element that the substance puts into the situation where it's like no matter what, you're locked out. You're locked out. There's someone smoking weed, you're not smoking weed, you're locked out, period. There's nothing you can do. And I think there's something about, which is part of why it's hard to like quit those things, because it's true. You're no matter what you do, you're not going to be high on weed no matter what. You're just not. So it's not going to happen. Like get over it, which is difficult. But with the psychedelics, I think it's interesting because that gets woven into like the spiritual. So there's almost this other element of like, people probably wouldn't articulate it this way, but it's like, well, I could go to Mount Athos, I could go to the Zen monastery, I could go to the mountains. If I go to the mountains, though, like, wouldn't it be better if I had acid? Like, I'm not going to have that magic thing no matter what. And I think that that also really messes with people's heads, me especially too, because yeah, there's that element of like, well, I can go to the cabin in the woods and do this, all the spiritual stuff, but no matter what, it's not going to be like that time I took acid because I'm not on acid and you're locked out. And I think that imparting that into the spiritual realm also gets like really dicey.
Yeah, it's a very tricky. It's a minefield, I think, for a lot of people, and it's one of those things that people should be very respectful towards. It's not something that you should do on a whim. But you also mentioned in your introduction that you have been someone who's been delving not only into this aspect of existence, but also you've been reading forbidden literature for the
Mhm.
longest time. I feel like these are comparable experiences in a way. It's you have forbidden experiences which are much more direct. Then you have forbidden knowledge, which is kind of more of a convoluted thing to do, but it's something you seem to be attracted to as well. So, are these experiences comparable? What did the forbidden literature bring to you?
That is interesting. I mean, there has to be some relationship there. I mean, it couldn't be a coincidence. I think there's something about. I talk about it in the intro also a little bit. In case people don't know, I didn't mention it, but the book is like a collection of comics, and there's just little bits of writing punctuating each chapter. So that's what we're talking about right now. And I think that there's something about being drawn to, I don't even want to say like the fringe and the weird. It's almost like being drawn to like the discarded or being drawn to the things that other people are saying, over there, like that's just a little bit of like a garbage dump. Or over there, like, dude, don't even look in that closet. Like, we all checked. There's like nothing in there. Like, don't even bother. I think it's kind of that thing that really draws me in more than anything else. This feeling of like finding something that other people haven't noticed or seen, which can be good or it can also be pathological. It could also be bad. It's definitely been both in my own life. But yeah, it definitely bled over or whatever bubbled up in the same way in terms of information. Because, yeah, at a certain point, it was still while I was doing psychedelics, but I also got really obsessed with exactly that. If there's anything that someone said, that's stupid, that's crazy, banned books or things like that, but especially anything where someone's like, yeah, that's crazy, those people are crazy, I've probably looked into it, probably to a really absurd degree, or it's on my radar to get to soon. I think that ultimately, honestly, aside from like actually like informational things that I took away, you read about this war and like, oh my God, these were the good guys, these were the bad guys, or you read about like this event or this figure, and oh my God, this guy knew this guy, and things like that are like tangible bits of information. I think it really, again, just drew me to this anchor of like worldviews and how worldviews function and things like that. Because once you start to jostle your own worldview a little bit, you start to see like, oh, people need, let's say like a bad guy, or this thing happened and people need to explain it in X, Y, and Z way. And I got really obsessed with things that didn't fit into the worldview. It's a very conspiracy thing, but showing people like, look at this video, like it's real, but they can't really admit that it's real because it would upset their whole worldview and things like that. So it really just made me think about how information and things function in terms of how people see the world more and more and more. And there's a poem by this poet I like named Rilke. He's probably my favorite poet ever, actually. And he says it's something like, I'm a bird and I'm circling this tower, and my circles get tighter and tighter and tighter around the tower, and I get closer and closer, but like I don't know what's inside, but I'm getting closer. The circles just get tighter and tighter. And that's kind of how I feel about all that stuff. It's almost like everything that I've looked into has gotten me tighter and closer to this thing that is how people see things and how they interpret information and how worldview affects, sounds redundant, but how we see the world.
So people are irrational. Are you saying or not?
Well, it's weird. It puts you in a weird place being someone obsessed with all this stuff because you start to feel like, well, I feel like I could poke into most people's worldviews and find something that doesn't fit in there. But then, of course, if you're a spiritual person, you can't be so arrogant to say, and I'm the exception. I'm like the number one rational actor and I see things as they really are. So I'm sure someone could do it to me also. But yeah, I think for most people, well, let me reorient the where we're going with this, because it's not really for most people. It's more like the zeitgeist and the general social programming that people happen to pick up just by virtue of kind of walking around and being in the culture and society. That's kind of like what I'm more interested in. Like, yeah, you could find a soccer mom and she thinks X, Y, and Z about whatever, but it's like the kind of programming, I hate to describe it that way, that people sort of pick up and manifesting the gaps in there and crawling into them and things like that. Like you can talk to someone, let's say a normal person, and they'll say, well, I'm just going to pick a random example. Let's say, oh, the winners write history. You can't, someone wins a war, they just say they were the good guys. And you're like, yeah, totally. And you're like, can you give me a specific example? And for most people, they're not comfortable. They've never put two and two together to be like, oh, yeah, I guess you're right, actually, or things like that, where finding these gaps and things that don't really stack up. Like the government lying about stuff is a good one. Everyone will admit the government lies about stuff, but for the average person who feels very antithetical to conspiratory style thinking, they'll say, well, yeah, the government lies about stuff all the time. And then if you're like, okay, like what in particular do you think? Sometimes they're like, well, I don't know. And you can see them kind of get uncomfortable because pinning it down gets very dicey. So the point is that, yeah, there's something about how it manifests on the individual level from, like, let's say the social program and things like that, that I got really obsessed with. And that's been one of my main focuses in a way. It also fits in with the spiritual and things like that. Because everyone has like a spiritual view also, and sometimes that's a little fuzzy or poorly defined, and how that manifests. I'm probably obsessed with it to a degree that you could probably get like diagnosed with something.
um, there are multiple zeitgeister, in our at least in our sphere at least. I mean, I think the internet is a generator of zeitgeister. Um, it's at least for me, and I think you kind of illustrate that very well in Comic X. It's kind of the story of you drifting away from the main zeitgeist, main narrative, and flowing into your own self-created or just in kind of arcane or exotic zeitgeist, and how, in a way, you're at a therapist on a therapist couch describing this as a pathology, and kind of feeling the alienation from the fact that you've ripped yourself from the main zeitgeist through your curiosity. And I feel the same as well, and I think like that's why this cartoon hits a nerve, because it's a very common experience, at least in especially in right wing circles. This is not Being right wing is not part of zeitgeist. Maybe it will be soon. Hopefully, there's kind of a splitting off zeitgeist, but it's not common. So, are there multiple ways of being in that way, or how do you feel towards that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's definitely, like, we could call it like whatever the main zeitgeist, and then maybe it fractals down into different sort of sub egregores, little like sub spirits and things like that. But I definitely think that I think part of why I started talking about it is a little bit of what you just touched on, where I really think there is like a kind of like pain at being out of step with whatever's going on around you and the people around you, that I don't want to say I never see people talk about it, but maybe it's partially because there's an element of reacting against this stuff and realizing what's going on for men. I don't know what it's like for women, honestly, at all, but for men, there is this element of like, well, yeah, like you guys are saying this, but like, I'm not going to view my masculinity as like pathological. I'm going to be a man, and like that's what this means, like X, Y, and Z. And that's great. That's actually really good, and I benefited a lot from it. But I think there is like an untouched element of like the pain and like how painful it is being out of step because of these things that and you can demonstrate are true, but it doesn't matter. People are just looking at you like you're completely insane. And I think that's also something I really wanted to articulate with my work in some way, just because at the time, at least, I was feeling that 1,000% every day. And I knew other people were, but I wasn't really seeing it manifested in a way that we could all like talk about it, honestly. Like for me, I'm basically the polar opposite of how I grew up in terms of most issues. And each one of those dominoes falling was really painful. I mean, take something like abortion. I grew up thinking like this is totally normal. It's just like getting a tooth pulled at the dentist or whatever. And when I personally came to the conclusion that that wasn't the case, I mean, that was crazy for me. It was really a crazy experience. And the people around me couldn't talk to them about it. They didn't want to know. If I tried to, they were like, you're now one of those people. Like, here's the wall. And that happens, just hundreds of times. After you close that door and you're like, okay, I finally got my head back on straight. It's like, boom, hit another wall. There's another one just as big. And I think that speaking to that aspect of it is a big part of what motivated my work. Still now, for sure, but definitely initially, for sure, because you're taking all this like psychic damage, and it makes you feel really alone. I think that's part of why people are gravitated towards the general sphere online. Actually,
Absolutely. And I feel that, at least in my case, there's a big tension between my aspiration to be trad or to live a more kind of tradition. I don't even know how to describe it. Something that's a bit more informed in reality. Informed in just the way humanity is supposed to be, at least in my perspective, and the fact that we just don't live in that kind of world. So I'm I feel like in a way thrust into a role of LARPer because the people around me are just they're not trad. They don't understand what I'm talking about. Even like I live in Romania, where people think, oh, that's a pretty backward place, and it isn't. It really isn't. Like most people are, very very chill with abortion, very very chill with they're hungering. They're hungering for anything that comes down the pipe from the U.S. There
yeah,
it's like there used to be like, oh, 20-year delay, 10-year delay, 5-year delay. Now there's like a week, maybe, not even, because Instagram is instant. So any mimetic virus that comes from the West is here. So like, I'm the consummate LARPer because I'm like, okay, always on the outside of society, and it's weird because I'm LARPing and I'm kind of forced to be, not forced, but I choose to be online where other people kind of share my worldview. And, it's a weird situation to be, a traditionalist online. And yeah, I see why people criticize this position, but it's not really, I don't know where to go, what to do, where to, do you see what I mean?
no, I totally do, and it's a really funny situation to be in because it kind of like ropes back to where we started, where it's almost like you're just normal, but being normal is now defined as this like extra big position, and you're trying to explicate like, well, what does it really mean to be trad? And people are coming along like, well, did you know actually in the 1920s it actually wasn't like how you think it is, you're imagining this, but then at the end of the day you're like, dude, like, I don't, for my wife is a good example, like she just wants to be a mom and just is like a stay-at-home mom, but almost that like makes her like reactionary somehow, like what. And it's this weird thing, it's kind of like where you started, like, how do you define yourself, because it's almost like you realize that you're actually not the, let's say, like electrically charged one. You're just responding to this society that's pushing so hard in all these different other directions. So yeah, it's a weird it's a weird place to be in, for sure. I mean, I enjoy it, but it's a weird place for sure.
Yeah, and it's, I don't know, I love it and it's fun for me. But I also I feel it, because it's also a little bit addictive, and I do spend too much time on Twitter. I have to say, it's a great place, but it's too great. It's like that Louis C.K. bit about drugs. They're so good they're gonna kill you. Um, I'm gonna quote you from your introduction, which is a very good piece of work. I've read um spectated most of the comics in the book. Um, so I'll read this from introduction because that's where the bulk of explanation about you is. So this body of work stretches through a very transformative period of my life. At the start, I was living intoxicated in a tiny apartment in a dirty part of the city. Now I pass a field full of cows every morning when I walk my dog, and my wife is pregnant. Not anymore, I think. There are tiny baby clothes in my house, and this struck me very very much because yeah, exactly. This is this is my arc as well. This is the hero's journey right here. Indeed, I was intoxicated in a tiny apartment, and yeah, kind of pretty much a dirty part of London. And now no cows, but baby, lots of cats I have, and tons of tiny baby clothes in my house, and it's really awesome. So, how fast did you make this transformation? What was the catalyst to get you from A to B?
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully, a lot of people have that situation, right? That would be the positive outcome of living in one of those apartments. Well, it's interesting because life sometimes has like a naturally sort of narrative and spectacular quality to it, and it really all hit all at once. one spiritual metaphor that I took away from going really hard into Zen Buddhism, which is not my main domain, just to be clear, but I went into it a little bit, is every theology has its own internal debates about little weird things. And in Zen Buddhism, they have a debate about whether or not enlightenment is sudden, like boom, it just happens in one moment. You're not enlightened than you are, or if it's gradual, if it's something that builds slowly over time. And I was talking with my friend one time about it, and he said, this is stupid because anything that's sudden, it kind of does happen gradually. There's always a buildup, whether or not you notice before the snap. And anything that's gradual, eventually it tips over and happens suddenly. So it kind of is like a false dichotomy. And in a way, looking back at the question that you're asking me, I kind of feel that way. It's like on the one hand, it's almost like you could pinpoint a day where it was like, boom, everything's different. But if you zoom back, there is like a slow buildup. Long story short, I had really fallen out with Buddhism, not actually because of anything inherently wrong with it, but my main questions about where the universe came from and why good and evil exist. It's sort of an interesting note in Buddhism because the main goal is escaping the cycle of death and rebirth. Buddha actually put supposedly where the universe came from on this list of things that you're not really supposed to think about because it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter for you trying to escape the cycle of death and rebirth. So who cares? So that was the kind of vibe I was getting from it. Like I had these two big questions in my mind, and it just wasn't really getting answered from this system I had made my home and place of spiritual residence. So I just kind of drifted away from it. On the dovetailing with the, you could call it, political front, I had kind of realized that I got really obsessed with Tibetan Buddhism, but that I'm not Tibetan. I'm a Western person. And that was the gateway to Western occult and things like that for me. I was thinking, well, in a way, not in a bad way, but Tibetan Buddhism, it's kind of like Tibetan occult. It's all this philosophy and practical things that you do. And I have this in my own backyard, which is like Western occult. So I'm just going to pour it over and start doing that. I tried to like live in that world. I think I had a kind of intrinsic spiritual I don't want to say revulsion, but like polarization from it. I didn't really, it sounds very LARPy, but this is what it's like if you're in Western occult world. It just felt weird doing these like magical ritual things. And like I got all the books and stuff, but I was like, man, I don't know. Like that was just my vibe on it. I was like, I really just feel like there's some reason I'm not doing this, but I don't know why. And my friends would ask me like, "Oh, did you do this thing?" And I'd be like, "No." And they'd be like, "Dude, it's been months. Like, why aren't you doing it?" And I was like, "I don't know, honestly. I really have no idea." In retrospect, I think it was just sensing there's something like nefarious and weird about it, which is probably obvious for us now, but at the time it wasn't for me. So I was really just floating, and my spiritual life just became like dead because I wasn't getting it from Buddhism. I wasn't getting it from Western occult. I was kind of just floating, being this guy. It just kind of died, and that was like a huge part of who I was. And long story short, the what really kicked it off is that I hit a wall. I just was like, I was drinking a lot and smoking weed all the time, like to an absolutely insane extent. And I kind of just hit this wall. We could go into it. It's kind of an interesting story.
Mhm.
It's very dramatic, I guess. Well, I won't tease you. I'll just tell you. So basically, I was drinking so much that I just woke up this one day and I checked my eyes in the mirror, and my eyes were actually yellow in the mirror. Sounds really crazy. It actually turns out that, long story short, it's because I have this other like underlying medical condition. But I thought in that moment that I had like accidentally like killed myself from drinking, which I didn't, thankfully. But that's what I actually really thought. And I was like, wow, like I really have been driving my car in a certain way down this road, and it's just not working. Like something, that was like the moment where I was like, something is like wired wrong, or I made a wrong conclusion somewhere. Like I have to backtrack or something. And even though I thankfully didn't die from that, and actually like showed me this other medical thing I had, which was really good to find out about. So it's kind of like a blessing in disguise. That was really the catalyst for me to be like, okay, this path that I'm going down isn't working, and I have to change something. And like you were saying, your friends, maybe, or I don't know if they were your friends or people they're wondering like, oh, can I go back down this road? Like, how far back can I go back? And that's really what I did. I kind of like backtracked my steps, and I was like, dude, I went wrong somewhere, but I really can't figure out what it is. And that's eventually what led me to Christianity, uh, realizing that God is real, taking that more seriously. And that really spilled out into the rest of my life because for me, this sort of naturally segues into the next part, but I really feel like being in a relationship, starting a family, kids, even just being husband and wife with someone, there is this like intrinsically spiritual dimension to it because it is really, really difficult. And it was kind of like everything just happened all at once. That's sort of why I told the story in that way. It was like, boom, like now the drugs are gone. Now these doors for these weird spiritual paths are closed. Now I'm looking at this differently. Now I'm looking at this differently. And it was like almost like one day, really. It was like, boom, here's the turnaround point in the movie. And from there, it was like a left turn off the highway. And I probably left the city maybe like not that long after that, man. Maybe like 4 to 6 months after I just put everything I owned in a van, including my wife. That's just a joke. And drove what, like several, not going to say exactly how far, but let's call it 1,000 miles out and restarted my life.
Yeah, that's also a surprisingly a pretty familiar story. I wonder for in terms of Christianity, did you have an epiphany, like a revelation, a moment where this kind of came to you, or did you just reason yourself into God's existence?
Well, the way I normally describe it, I guess usually everyone's conversion story or whatever could fill like a whole book probably, but the way that I normally, and it often does, like confessions, for example, I think the way that I normally describe it is that oddly, again, filtering back to what we talked about before, it kind of feels like the way that you get turned on to like a conspiracy theory, as odd as that parallel is, because it's never, oh, here's the bloody glove, and that means that this guy was the murderer in the chess room. We proved it. Great. It's more like you start to stack up these bits of evidence, and eventually I just felt like I'm an idiot if I keep I have this massive pile of evidence, and now it's like a conspiracy theory for me to dismiss it. It feels stupid to be like, well, all these arrows are pointing in this one direction, but I'm not going to look over there. That just felt like what I was doing at a certain point. So it was a few things. When you're in like the Western occult world, because it's so individually oriented, this guy Mircea Eliade, probably saying his name wrong. Actually, I think he's Romanian. Just interesting
Yeah, he
tangent.
is. He is.
Yeah,
Mircea Eliade would be.
nice. Yeah. He nailed in one of his books exactly the draw to the occult, in my opinion, because he said self initiation is the perennial fascination with the occult, the fact that you kind of like initiate yourself. And it's just relevant because I feel like a lot of it is kind of like, especially if you're the kind of person I am, like sitting in the lab of your mind and kind of tinkering with ideas and trying to figure out things for yourself. And I actually had reasoned myself really close to Christianity in a way. I had this moment where I was sitting on my bed and I was like, well, I know God is real. I'm 100% sure of that because for me, creation proves God. I know that it's not like some kind of abstract, like cloud of nebulous qualities God, because morality for me proves that God has some interest in like human affairs. So I'm like, creation is real. I can see that. Morality is real. I can see that. So I can deduce like certain things about God from that. He cares about humans in a way. And I kind of got to this point where I was like, well, God is such a big thing to dumb it down that he must have some kind of like, I don't know what word to use, like emissary or emanation or something that would be like an interface for humans that like humans could understand. And I sort of kept working on that. And I was like, this is kind of like what Christianity is in a way. There's like the Father God, and then he has this Son that's like to dumb it down again. I know I'm not being like theologically sound, but like the interface, kind of the person who is like, oh, we can like understand he's like a human. I get it. But then there's like the big, more complex God beyond that, let's say. And I was like, wow, this is really weird. I really reasoned myself really close to Christianity and I really didn't know what to think about it. And that just stacked on top of, a lot of other things like seeing in history that I was really drawn towards all the societies that were Christian or that were built in like a Christian way. And I was like, is that a coincidence? Maybe, but probably not. And Christian values and things the Bible was telling me. In a way, there's like a third sort of aspect to it where I almost felt like Christianity for my whole life was like this crazy guy that lived in my neighborhood. And sometimes he would tell me something and I'd be like, that guy's so crazy. And then later I'd be out and I'd see something and I'd be like, oh, wow, that's so weird. That's what that crazy guy said would happen if someone did that. Wow. And then I'd go back and he'd tell me something else. And then eventually I was like, okay, that guy is obviously onto something. So it was sort of all those things stacking up and the arrows got more and more bold and highlighted. So that's really what it was for sure. For me, it's not really like the way people often talk about religion and spirituality, I really don't feel like I have like a blind faith element. For me, looking at creation and everything, I'm like 100% sure God is real. And then I kind of reason backwards from there. So I just mentioned that because I think that puts me in a little bit of a different boat when people ask about religious and spiritual progress. Because I think most people are imagining it's like you get to the edge of the dock and then you make some kind of leap of faith, like, well, I guess it must be real. And you make a leap of faith or something, which is fine. But for me, it's like I'm working backwards. It's like I'm 100% sure God is real. And then I'm kind of trying to trace the threads back from there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to be. That's kind of a solid foundation. I think my belief is more kind of Girardian, like kind of I don't think it could be any other way, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, yeah,
Kind
totally.
of my reductio ad absurdum, but that's a more shaky way of looking at things. You know, it's not. It doesn't really fuel itself. It's like it would be pretty terrible if it was any other way.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting, yeah, I'm curious with other people, because maybe I could, I could source some more epiphanies some other places. I feel like I need it. One question that always comes up, and a lot of people ask me this because I am trad. Apparently, I've slid into the trad space. Finding a wife. You seem to have found a wife like that, very very fast, very effectively. How did you go about finding a wife and whisking her, taking her away to your country, like pastoral existence right now?
That's a really good question. Well, I almost feel like bad in a way when people ask me for advice on that because I sort of accidentally ran a cheat code on that front, which would only be useful for someone very young. But I accidentally found myself working in the sphere and domain where it is almost without exaggeration, entirely women and gay men, which is the arts in general. Um, so, really, honestly, totally without exaggeration, my entire, I guess you could say, career, including school and everything like that, it's always been like 90% women, 10% gay men, and me. That's really what it actually feels like. So people ask me, and I always just feel like I have to contextualize it because I want to be like, go out in the woods and go hunting. But I have to say, like, I live in the place with the most ducks, though, so it's kind of like different for me. So that must have been a factor. I have to, not give myself too much credit. But aside from that, I think that there's a few factors there that I just got really lucky on in a way. I started, well, I had been dating another girl, and it's just relevant because, sorry to my wife who's going to listen to this, it didn't mean anything really, but it's just relevant because she was like a hardcore science, atheist, pop culture, media person. And I was like, oh, we're opposites. That's so cool. Opposites go together in a way. Like, this will work out perfectly. And like, it really didn't. And that's when I thought, okay, I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to find someone who's on a similar page to me in a way. And what ultimately sparked me asking my wife on a date is that my friend told me that she went to this party where people were doing like crystal ball stuff and things like that, which seems very antithetical to my worldview now. But I was like, okay, boom, I'm asking that girl on a date because I was just like, I'm closing the materialism door. If this girl's into like weird spiritual stuff, let's go. Like, that's perfect. And I kind of caught her right at the moment that I started to sort of figure everything out, which means that we kind of went on that journey together, which was really convenient. I think that trad people in general are sort of caught in like a catch 22 in a way, to be completely honest with you, because I have certain ideas, I guess, about how male and female spirituality manifests and is different. And with the caveat that obviously I am Christian and under that umbrella for sure, I do think that it manifests a little bit differently. I think men tend more towards like arguments and like theology and like, oh, but what does this canon number 102 say about this? Or like, 4 hour long arguments about like absolute divine simplicity or something. Not that women don't do that. Usually, honestly, they don't, which is probably good. But I think that there's something about the way female spirituality manifests where it kind of makes sense that part of the stereotype is like, tarot cards and crystals and things like that, and this more like intuitive feeling based thing. I'm actually not saying that in a negative way at all. I actually kind of mean it in a positive way. My point is that I feel like with everything that's going on in terms of like femininity and messages about femininity and things like that, there's this sort of odd sync up that's not very intuitive, where a lot of those girls who are into the weird things like that, like what I just described, it's almost like that actually puts them in touch with their femininity in a way, and has, unbeknownst to them, kind of insulated them against a lot of these messages. Because if you're that kind of person, let's say you take someone that's even on the tail end of that, like let's say they're into like witchy stuff or, things like that, in a way that can insulate a woman against these messages of like, basically you and men are like the same, or, there's nothing really, things like that. And I think that that was a big factor in us syncing up and taking it all the way there, because I think even at that time, she really was like, it sounds stupid because it's obvious, but like she really was like embodying like the female aspect of that in a certain way. I was embodying the male aspect of that in a certain way. And I really felt like we synced up in like a yin yang, and that that's part of what's allowed us to go like all the way there. I just mentioned it because I feel like it's sort of a catch 22. You can't advise like a trad guy, like, go find a girl who's playing with tarot cards and like convince her it's bad and then take her to your pastoral Christian abode on some hill. So it's kind of a long answer, but those are like some touchstones in there. As for how we literally met, which is less interesting, we met at work. um, and yeah, I guess I'm kind of wandering around, but I kind of just mentioned that about her background because I think that that's sort of what made us come out here and go all the way. Like for her, it wasn't like a big shift in worldview to say, okay, now we're leaving the city and we're going to go live in the rural place and we're going to raise a kid. And by the way, when we have the kid, like I don't want him like eating plastic. She was like, yeah, I know. Obviously, that's what's going to happen. Sort of a long, windy answer, but that's basically how it went down.
Yeah, that's really interesting because that's kind of what I noticed as well, in terms of people that I know and kind of the mommy sphere that I've been kind of thrust into now that I'm a mommy as well. A lot of kind of the appreciation for motherhood, and kind of the residual appreciation for motherhood you can find still in places that are tied in some way to the occult, because you don't really have that religious mainstream. But you do have people interested, like you said, in tarot and like the zodiac, obviously very big, astrology, things like that. Chinese traditions that it's all very, to me, I'm also kind of kind of a rigorous, very systematizing type person. So to me, that was never really that interesting. Like if you can't really, put it in a spreadsheet, I'm not
Yeah.
sure it's relevant. But I could see that that's kind of a repository of a lot of femininity and a lot of appreciation for other archetypes than the maiden, because that's essentially what you have in mainstream culture now. You have to be a maiden until the day you die, but you also maybe won't die because you might be frozen, or you continue in the metaverse or something like that. It's maiden, transhumanist maiden forever. And any other archetype, mother's kind of like an inconvenience. We don't really talk about that because it might mess up your career trajectory or whatever. And prone, oh god, that's only negative. So yeah, it's I think there's a lot of value in that. I personally, I've just seen it from the sidelines, but I understand why it might be a good place to research in case you are in the market for one.
Yeah, and I mean, it has been interesting, not to like totally mischaracterize like our relationship to it, but it has been interesting for her, I think also. Like for me, it's like I kind of was like identifying with like, oh, I'm like this, Western occulty like wizard guy, like doing mushrooms and reading Plato and stuff. And then not growing out of that, it's kind of like a value judgment, I guess, but like shifting over into having a more God-based worldview and what that means and all the little particulars of it. I mean, you can imagine I was doing all this art and all of a sudden I was like, wow, I'm about to really like U-turn this whole apparatus here. It's kind of like she's been going through the same thing. And I think that also, you know, has colored our relationship in a way. And I would imagine that a lot of women coming into the sphere you described, where female style spirituality, I probably could come up with a better term for that, but I think people know what I mean, is sort of maybe in the background unexpectedly. Like you just said, you're on some mom Facebook group and it's like kind of like an astrology time sometimes, right? I bet that's probably pretty interesting for people navigating that and figuring out what the whole situation is there and how they should vibe with it and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely a bit of an outsider because I'm kind of I've gained a lot of femininity, a lot of feminine aspects that I didn't have to my personality by becoming pregnant, becoming a mom. You know, things that you need when you're a mom, and it's been quite interesting because I've changed a lot.
Yeah, that's
It's like just thinking about myself now. I'm like I don't really know. I'm just a protection mechanism for this new being. I do not have a personal essence, so it's fine. It's
yeah.
relaxing.
Well, it's really awesome, honestly, because it really that for me really is like the powerful manifestation of femininity. I mean, I guess that sounds obvious, but it's really like an infinitely deep, like spiritual thing. Like I often joke with my wife, like she'll be doing something with the baby, and I'm like, wow, you women, you guys are pretty crazy out there. That's nuts. But I'm kind of joking, but it actually is. It's for me, that's really like almost like an apotheosis, like a divinization of the feminine in this way that is like so spectacular that it's really interesting to even just be around like as a man, like I'm holding the baby. I'm sure you're in this situation too. Like I'm holding the baby and he's crying and he's hungry and I'm just standing there as a man and I'm like, wow, I literally can't do anything about this. I'm like the idiot. Just I can't do anything. Like I need the woman to it's like not I can't do anything. I'm just useless here. And things like that are really interesting, obviously going through the whole like process of like, gestating and birthing the child and everything. It's just interesting because yeah, that's definitely some aspect of real female power that I mean it's obvious in our circles, but it's really interesting to be around and have seen it firsthand and to watch it develop day by day. It's really something.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's by far the most spiritual thing that has ever happened to me. Like, my position on abortion before was libertarian-ish. I was judgy about it. I didn't take it lightly, but now it is very different. Growing a human is just it's mind blowing. It's like how does this happen? Every day you're like, he's in there.
Yeah, no, dude, I know exactly what you mean. And it's definitely, I mean, it's probably, I have to assume you're kind of saying it's the same for you, but it's definitely affected my relationship to like certain theological questions and spiritual questions. And I almost feel like if you stacked up like the books I've read, you can kind of see where the baby comes into play and how I'm starting to ask like different questions. And, of course, both of us, we're going to now be stewarding the spiritual life of the child, whether passively or actively, hopefully actively. And that's a whole other framework to play in. It's a game changer, obviously, but to experience it is something different.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. And it's also interesting to look at one thing that I was quite familiar with before I had my baby, and now I have a totally different relationship to it. It's kind of the manosphere. I used to be kind of a forum lurker, just taking in the information that people put out there because I've got tough skin. I don't mind seeing controversial opinions and stuff, but now I feel like I really do feel like the manosphere is down bad. Like in the last few months, man, it's like it's to me it feels like it kind of like it's obviously kind of the opposite polar end of rad femme thinking. It's very liberal. It's very like what's in it for me. And now I'm in my marriage and I have kind of this spiritual obligation. It's not even obligation, a spiritual privilege to be part of this marriage, and it's a completely different setup. It's not what's in it for me. It's not like I don't have expectations of my husband, but it's a different thing. And seeing this tit for tat game that they're playing, and it's like, yes, the women that are in that relationship to you that have transactional relationships, because that's what you're selling. You're selling, how do you win a transactional relationship with a woman? They're gonna screw you over because you're just playing tit for tat. And at one point, someone is not going to reciprocate, and it might be earlier, it might be later. You're playing for bigger stakes or lower stakes. All of these combinations are possible, but it's just really I don't know. I cannot relate to it anymore.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And yeah, it's almost like sometimes you see people giving relationship advice and you're like, okay, I'm not qualified to give relationship advice, but I don't know what you're talking about, buddy. And I really feel like that all the time. There's really something about like I don't want to call it like the gender wars thing, but I think that if you're a married person in a relationship and you've gone down the road to some extent, it's almost like I don't know if other married people feel this way, but I guess they must. It's like that can only happen if there's a certain level of like goodwill and assuming the best of the other person and like you just said like we're in this together that I almost feel like a lot of the gendery conversations online it's almost like by starting in this place of polarization and I don't want to say hostility but like negative assumptions I guess you could say for me, it's almost like the conversation is like dead on arrival because if you're starting the
Mhm.
conversation from like, here's what men are doing wrong and this is why and this is their problem and stuff like even if hypothetically all that stuff was is true, it's like you're not gonna step into a situation where both people are meeting and shaking hands halfway, which is the only way any of this is going to happen. And same deal with both sides, let's say. So yeah, that's something I kind of picked up on. It's like I don't even enter those conversations because it's almost like I'm rejecting the premise like from the get go, which again I think also has to do with like the spiritual situation that is for me not even the background but like the base layer of it.
Yeah, I think being a woman in right wing circles and in a minority, if people want dating advice from me, like where are you guys? Where you at? And yeah, I tend to try my hand at it, but it is really hard. And like you said, they're very unique situations. I met my husband on a dating app, but I also kind of was in a very specific mindset. I was looking at a very specific type of person. Yeah, it's very hard. I was thinking about, maybe making something that could give advice to people, but it's just so weird. There's such a unique situation that I was in and he was in, and yeah, like you said, you were immersed in, in a sea of women, so it was a bit easier.
Well, yeah, there's definitely, I really relate to that feeling a lot. There is the feeling of like, man, I can see there's like something missing here or like a missing piece. And for me, it's like when I'm talking with my wife in the car sometimes, like I'll be like, man, like if I could just not bottle this, but just like what you just said is just like perfect and like, but it's really hard to take it and give it. And then you're in the position of like giving advice and that's a whole like weird thing. But yeah, I really know exactly what you're getting at for sure.
Yeah, because I feel like, this is the extreme example, but a lot of men are like, oh, they're divorce rate, but they met a cocktail waitress named Tiffany, and they married her 3 times in 3 different incarnations, and they're like, oh, women are demons, and I'm like, yeah, and then I know a lot of women who married people who they probably should have known were a bit shifty, more on like the criminal type, or more on like big ego type of guys who ended up cheating on them, or divorcing them when they got older. And yeah, this is the kind of the reverse of that. The same situation, is you kind of attract what you put out there, and it's hard to there's so many factors in here that it's very hard to give people advice. But yeah, be careful what you wish for, I guess, and what vibes you put out. I don't know if that's good advice. See, that's why I'm not writing this dating advice book,
Yeah.
not very practical.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and then you see people like in their relationships, but it kind of again like comes back to what I was talking about before, where it's almost like when I see people that are in relationships and they often ask me for advice. To be totally honest with you, always feel like I'm kind of zooming out so far and seeing how it fits into their conception of like relationships in general that it's almost like meta relationship advice, which is like interesting. But then is that like very practical? So yeah, I will say that I honestly find it pretty endlessly fascinating, which I think is an interesting part of my shift in worldview over time. When I was back on like let's say like Buddhism, psychedelics, occult side, like I couldn't honestly have cared less about the inner workings of different people's lives. I mean, like I cared about them. I wasn't like a psychopath, but I really was just like, that's crazy. It's just like some random stuff that's happening to you, I guess. Like, okay, like I feel bad, but what am I going to do about it? But it's interesting because now that I am Christian and I can't help but feel like the two are related in some way, it's almost the opposite. Like the detail, not in a gossipy way, but like the details of how people's problems manifest and how it affects them spiritually and what it means for them and like the morality of it and what's good and what's bad. It totally flipped. And now I find that super, super interesting. And I feel like the empathy I have for them is a lot more real. Not that I'm perfect. People have empathy for me too. I have problems too. But yeah, there's something really interesting about that too. Like I really do feel I'm more interested in it now in a way that kind of dovetails with my general view of the world that I can't exactly pin down, but they are related in some way.
Yeah, this kind of comes back to your perspective on worldviews. I feel like because you've internalized that lens on the world, and you can kind of understand that even if you disagree with someone on the face of it, you can kind of understand where they're coming from on a meta level. I mean, it sounds a bit pompous, but it's like you can you if you know where someone's coming from, it's easier to empathize with them, even if you don't agree on almost anything.
Yeah, that's definitely true. There's also an aspect of it that I think has to do with like suffering and problems and engaging with the world where if I had to boil it down, it's kind of like in Buddhism, suffering is like something bad to be avoided. In fact, like the whole point of it is to figure out how to not suffer anymore. I mean, Buddha's life story is basically that he was in the palace, right? Some people know, some people probably don't, but he was basically a prince in a palace, didn't really know suffering existed, found out suffering existed, people die, people get sick, the world is like messed up. And then the rest of his spiritual journey was like, well, how can I avoid that? How can I not have that happen? And how can I disengage from that? But for me, that's part of like why I rejected it because I was like, well, it's actually kind of the opposite if you think about it. The suffering and the problems and how we work out these little minutia, that's not like a glitch in the matrix. That's like kind of what life is about. Sounds very like corny and obvious, but within Christianity, when Jesus came to earth, he like did a lot of suffering in case people haven't heard. And I don't think that's incidental. I think there is something about the imperfections that obviously manifest in relationships in one way and how we engage with like these specific weird little aspects of life where now my perspective has shifted totally and I'm almost like, oh, that's actually kind of the point and that's actually what part of like what we're here to do in a way. It's just interesting on the relationship note, because people often think of their relationship problems as like a glitch that like shouldn't be there to, how can we smooth this out, how can we fix this like error in the code or something. But for me, I really shifted and started seeing it as like an opportunity for like spiritual growth, which sounds like unfathomably cheesy, but it really is true. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff is kind of, in a way, aspirational. I understand exactly what you mean. It's like, even when you're saying this, it doesn't mean that you're working towards internalizing these values. It's not like I'm sure you haven't perfected this perspective and live it to its fullest every day. At least this is my experience because I agree completely with you on this, and that's kind of how I see my relationships as well. As I've become infinitely more patient, infinitely more. Kind of gentle by internalizing this perspective, but it's hard. It doesn't come naturally.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I think also part of where I'm at with it now is asking a lot more, I don't even want to call them like theological questions, but I feel like a lot of my spiritual research and what's directing it now is like asking myself questions about, well, like, yeah, I'm married to my wife. What does that mean? Like to dumb it down, like what does that mean for like the afterlife? When I go to heaven, like are we still going to be married? Like because if not, that's like kind of weird. Like I'm going to go to heaven and my wife's going to be there and she's going to be like not my wife. Like that doesn't make any sense. What? And things like that and like even just I have this child now and like I really feel like my relationship to him obviously is not incidental. It's like an intrinsic part of my personhood and what does that mean for my spiritual life and how does that fractal out and color the whole view of what it means to be human, why we're here and things like that. I feel like within a Christian context it's a really 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 interesting place to be because a lot of those answers on the folk level, I'm not saying in the big like 3,000 page books, but on the folk level, I think a lot of that is relatively fuzzy for people, for sure. I mean, I think if you asked 10 to 15 Christian people, what's heaven like? Like literally, what are you going to do there? A lot of them would say like, well, I'm going to be with my family. But is that actually part of
Mm.
like the theology of Christianity? I mean, in some ways it is, but and I'm really working like in that space now and it's super interesting. It's taking me to some really interesting places. And yeah, it's been a huge part of like my spiritual development, thinking about that. And even things like, I have this baby here, right? Where did his consciousness come from? I mean, did it literally spark when he was like in the womb, or, just so it really, the whole family situation explodes into all these questions that weren't important to me before, but now they're like the primary focus now for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to ask you the question of the show, which might be inspired from your recent studies, or might be inspired from other events in your life. But do you have a thinker, it could be a writer, an artist, or someone who's been really influential in your thinking that you think deserves a bit more of an audience, or is underrated? A subversive thinker, I usually ask. So, is there anyone you could recommend to people?
That's the question of the show. That's awesome.
It is indeed.
Okay, so a subversive thinker. Well, okay,
Mhm.
honestly, I'm gonna come so far out of left field right now because I know what my answer is, and it's not gonna be popular. I'm not endorsing this person, but if you're asking me that question, also based on what I was just saying, it's pretty hard for me not to say Joseph Smith, who is the guy who founded and started Mormonism, which is probably
Mhm.
so random for most people. But I think that I have no firm opinion on, people have seen the South Park episode, they know about Mormonism, like he found these gold plates. I have no opinion about that. I wasn't there. Maybe it's fake. Seems like it was probably not real, obviously, right? But weird things happen. But for me, that's been the subversive thinker throwing curveballs into my life, honestly, because I was doing so, Christian history is like a huge thing that I'm interested in, and it's almost my primary interest now. And I realized I had a huge gap from, I would say, like the Pilgrims to Pentecostals, from like 1600 ish to like now there are people speaking in tongues in America. It was all kind of like a gray area for me. So I dove into that, and I started looking at these 1800s American groups, and it's a really interesting time in case people don't know, because all of a sudden you have this explosion of different groups like Seventh Day Adventists and the Mormons, and there's all these different groups that are really atypical. And I started going into them, and I was hitting, I hit the Seventh Day Adventist pretty hard, and I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting, but okay. But the thing that really tripped me up about Mormonism is that really unexpectedly, I started to take the view of it as, so totally neutrally. I'm not Mormon, in case people don't know that. But I started to view it as like, this is almost like a patch that this guy came up with that sort of like reorients Christianity around the family in this really weird way that made me have to go deeper into it and reflect back on what I think about all these things. And it's really been insane, because it's kind of like what I just said. If you ask most Christian people, what's heaven going to be like? If I ask my mom that, my mom's going to be here tonight. She's driving from another state. If I asked her, she's not Christian, but it doesn't matter. What are you going to do in heaven? She would say instantly, I'll be with my family. Well, that's not classical Christian theology. If you were going to find a religion that says that, it would be Mormonism, actually. And the way that it sort of takes the theology and like puts these patches on it and flips a few things up and down and makes it about like families and family life and having children, whether it's true or not, really has been upending my thinking about a lot of things. And I've been going into it for quite some time now. I kind of have the luxury of, I can really go really hard into a worldview or system of thinking and not adopt it. I think other people sometimes have an issue with that. But for me, I don't. I can read, Jehovah's Witnesses stuff for 3 months out of pure interest and walk away and be like, all right, well, I'm not Jehovah's Witness. That was interesting. Um, so for me, that's really been the subvert. If that's the question, that's been the subversive thinker that I think has not only upended my own sort of way of thinking about things, but I think that in general, if I was going to try and make like a somewhat like controversial statement, especially within like the Christian sphere, I really think like the way that Mormon theology is dismissed as like a total joke is not warranted. Whether that has nothing to do with whether it's true or not, but the way that it's like, oh yeah, like gold plates, like LOL, it really is like deeper than that in a way that I really was like totally blindsided by. And it's been super interesting. Like I have this kid, and like just one example. So most people probably don't know unless they're Mormon, but the whole Joseph Smith system and ideas really goes in, and it just adds these little things into the theological framework that kind of change everything. So, like, for example, one example would be there's something called a premortal existence. So, for my kid, if you were Mormon, you would say, he had a pre-mortal existence. He lived before this in like a kind of like spirit way, and then chose to come to earth here. And then now I have this kid, and he's Owen Jr., but he actually had like, I'm repeating myself, but a pre-mortal existence. But that's just really interesting because the ramifications of that and how that bleeds out into everything from like ethics to what we're doing here and why we're here get really, really, really interesting. As a practical example, one of the main theological questions is that of theodicy, i.e., why bad things happen, and basically why bad things happen. Theodicy is if God real, why bad thing happen, and that really clears up a lot of things in a way if you choose to adopt that framework, because then it flips the whole Christian system upside down because he chose to come here. So it's not like he's like cursed to wander and like, let's say, God forbid, he breaks his leg or something later. It's not like something that was thrust upon him. He like chose to come here, and then there's this different situation in the afterlife. So I could honestly go on about it because it's been crazy. But my answer would be neutrally, with no examination of whether it's true or not. The subversive thinker, I mean, it would be Joseph Smith for sure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've had another guest who was Mormon on the show, and I feel like there's kind of a small contingent of people who really take Mormonism seriously and are promoting it, and are kind of 'cause it is still a religion of converts. It's a hard one to propagate through like hereditary way, and it's in trouble now in many ways. But yeah, it's definitely in terms of results and in terms of just the quality and the lifestyles and just the happiness that you see in the families that really go hard on Mormonism. There's probably none comparable to how they live.
Yeah, that's true. My gateway into it. So just for the record, also, this is just funny in terms of being an internet person who is Christian but doesn't belong to any group. Because whenever I talk about one group, I get people who really don't like that group hitting me up like angry about it. Like if I go into Catholic stuff, like I'll go in my DMs and I have all these Protestants like, oh, why are you promoting this? And if I talk about Orthodoxy, I'll go to these Catholics who are like, oh my God, why are you promoting this? So just interesting. If you're going to DM me, I mean, don't bother. I'm not like promoting it. I'm just mentioning it. Um, but what really flipped my view on it and made me think of, like I said, Joseph Smith as a subversive thinker in that way, um, was this essay someone sent me that was called, it's really more like a mini book. It's like a series of essays. It's called Speculations of a Theoretical Mormon. And it was this guy who's not Mormon, who I guess, I don't know when he wrote it, but now he would be probably classed as like somewhat reactionary. And it was just this series of things he wrote, kind of just like what I'm saying, like, hey, I'm a weird guy, I'm not Mormon, but I'm looking at this and here's my like thoughts on it. And it really kind of flipped my view, partially because of what you just said. He was saying, like, the whole rest of the Christian world looks at Mormonism like as a bunch of like dumb idiots who are a joke. But he was like, we're really not in a position to be casting stones from where we're sitting. Because if you look at them, like, I mean, their kids don't even, well, theoretically, like they don't drink, they don't do this stuff. And, drinking is really tied to sexual promiscuity. So that's pretty interesting that, you pull this rug out of this thing that allows people to have these like hyper casual sexual relationships with each other. And the way, like I said, it's kind of reoriented around the family. Instead of having like a priestly caste, the father is like the leader of the family spiritually in a way more explicit way than other systems. And his conclusion about it was like, I don't know if he ever became Mormon or if he just thought about it a lot, but he said if this is true, you could kind of view it as like a reorganization of Christianity around the family unit, prepping for this time period that we're in now, where you have this unprecedented assault on the family. And it's kind of interesting because if you think back through history, I mean, there's this kind of like weird, I mean, everyone listening to this definitely knows this like weird kind of assault on like just normal family relationships and stuff that really wasn't present before a certain time period, let's say. And that was his, I think, neutral kind of like best case scenario view of it. It's kind of just, he was saying, it's kind of just interesting that you have this thing that comes along presenting itself as a theological patch. And it's basically entirely about reorganizing Christianity around the family unit. And for me, that's been really interesting because, like I said, I'm not Mormon, but now I'm turning back towards the domains that I normally hang out in. And I'm like, okay, so what do you guys have to say about, I'm married to my wife. Am I married to her forever? Like, let's go. Like, I need, I need some answers here, buddy, and I need them right now. So it's been really interesting, and it's less so like tempting to join. No offense to any Mormons listening, and more so like a catalyst for a lot of very interesting theological investigation that I've been going really hard on.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are on their way to a lot of very interesting theological investigation, and I think this is a really good recommendation. We've had, I think, Brigham Young was
Oh,
recommended
really?
before by the Mormon guest.
That's really funny. Yeah,
Yeah, which is at Extra Dead JCB if anyone is curious about that episode. But I think that's a good episode, and also kind of goes a bit deeper into Mormonism and why, and
nice.
how come. um, so I want to thank you for coming on. This has been really, really fun. I also want to direct people to the purchase of the book Channel One. It's a beautiful book. I don't have it in hardcover, but I might purchase it because it's awesome. And I had my husband, because I was reading it on my laptop, and my husband was like right next to me, and he was like giggling at the comics. He was kind of like entranced by what I was looking at, and I think he was kind of in on the joke, and it was really good.
Cool.
So yeah, for the entire family, it seems. So please do buy that and follow Owen at, I think, is it Owen Cyclops on
Yeah,
Twitter.
well, Twitter's my main hub. It's at Owen Broadcast. Confusingly, my name's Owen Cyclops at Owen Broadcast. I'm also on pretty much every other social media platform. I'm on Instagram. I'm probably one of the only people that has a Tumblr and a Gab, which is a really funny overlap, but I'm trying to get the images out there as much as possible. But yeah, I'm really glad you liked the book, and thanks for having me on. This was really, really a good time.
Awesome, thank you so much.